All right, everybody, come on in. Happy Friday. I guess happy Friday. Aaron Rupar, who's joining me today, has watched and shared more MAGA nonsense than anyone in America. He does this because we need to know it, but also to protect us from having to do it ourselves. You can find his work on social media and on Public Notice, a regular newsletter on Substack. It's just fabulous. He's also a proud Minnesotan who's helped, I guess, the whole country understand that experience better, what it's like during the tyranny of federal occupation. So, Aaron, I guess, first, I should let everybody know your day job means you may get called off to cover something that President Trump does, in the next half hour. So everybody just get ready for that. That's a reality when you have to do the news in real time.
He's on his way down to North Carolina for a speech to the troops, which, as we've seen over the years, can be very inappropriate in that context where, he's supposed to be kind of the commander in chief, but he'll end up, surveying whether he should call Joe Biden Sleepy Joe or Crooked Joe. And, so these things can get kind of wild and woolly, but I think he's safely in the air right now. So we should have a good bit of time here before he takes the stage.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of stuck at, you said he could be kind of inappropriate somewhere. I'm not sure where he isn't kind of inappropriate. Hey, before we get into any of that, how are things in Minneapolis? Have they calmed down at all? I know they said they were leaving, but my experience in Chicago is what they say they're going to do and when they do it are not the same thing.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit too early to say still. I will say, just kind of monitoring ICE activity today, that it has been a little bit quieter than it has been. Now, they've been quite active out in the suburbs, and that transition has been going on for a couple weeks, where, as the pushback became pretty intense in the city proper, where, these ICE officers were getting shouted down or whistled at or kind of tracked, around when they were going to, on their roving patrols. They kind of shifted more of their operations out into the suburbs, where I think they can operate with a bit more impunity. There's just not as many eyes on them. And so even today, I've seen a lot of reports from the suburbs of ICE activity, of them being like posted up in parking lots or, at bus stops and things like this, which is always kind of, those are always harrowing reports to receive. It's a favorite technique of theirs to, kind of harass parents and kids. But it does seem a little bit quieter today. Now, just listening to some of the local officials yesterday, it seemed like the time frame for this is that they were really expecting the drawdown to kind of take place over this weekend into next week. Now, ICE has said, or I guess CBP and some DHS officials, that they're going to leave behind sort of like almost like a strike force type team here, which I think is kind of similar to what happened in Chicago, where we actually in Public Notice ran a Q&A just last week with Delia Ramirez, the congresswoman, who talked about, how in her district, which was really heavily hit when ICE was active in Chicago a few months ago, people are still being taken in her neighborhood. ICE is still active there. It's still affecting families and businesses in the community. So I expect that that's kind of what we're looking at here. But I will say, very preliminarily, since the drawdown was just announced yesterday, that it has been noticeable today that ICE has been less active than they have been in previous Fridays going back a couple months now.
I know from my own experience in Chicago how hard it is to believe that ICE is gone when they leave, how much it works to rebuild, to recover. In Ramirez's district, I've been bringing people over for weeks to go eat and shop in that district because of the economic carnage on top of the human loss over there. The scars are deep for sure, but Aaron, also my pride in what my city did and the people here did, and I'm sure you feel it there too, the incredible and inspiring sacrifice, the determination to protect our neighbors, and the refusal to be pushed around by these ICE thugs is a remarkable and beautiful thing.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think that's been really inspiring. We just moved back into the city last summer, and it's been pretty harrowing between the school shooting that occurred not far from us in August, and then of course this federal occupation. So, had I known all of that, maybe we would have delayed it for a year or something like that to avoid some of this. But given all of the circumstances that have been going on, yeah, it's been really inspiring that even like my wife, for instance, has been active in giving rides to kids, whose families are affected where their parents can't show up, or, they're feeling at risk of being affected by ICE or CBP in one form or another. And, there's countless stories like that of people who have really stepped up, even in some cases to get groceries or even take out the trash, because there were stories about people being detained, just, going outside to take out their trash and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, it really has kind of unified the entire community here. And so to the extent that the calculation on Trump's behalf was that, you could kind of break the community here in Chicago or in LA County and, kind of shock and awe people into submission, or at least kind of like being more reticent to speak out. I think that's backfired pretty spectacularly. And, I think you see that in the way this is being framed, where, of course, people like Tom Homan are paying lip service to Operation Metro Surge being in their eyes a huge success. And, they've helped drive down crime here, which of course is not true, since 2/3 of the murders in Minneapolis have been committed by DHS this year. But, so they're going to say what they're going to say. But I think the reality is that they're kind of withdrawing somewhat under duress and kind of abruptly. I think signals that this hasn't gone well for them, that even not just among like hardcore Democrats, but I think people who are independent or center right have been pretty appalled by this. And, I got together with some friends last week, a number of whom work in Democratic politics and are pretty clear-eyed about this stuff. And, the sense on the ground here is that this has been really, really bad for Republicans in the state, where kind of the calculation about, the upcoming election statewide and congressional in November has really changed. And Republicans have been really wrong-footed, or kind of like, I guess, humiliated by Trump in a way, because, even there is, it's similar to Illinois, I would expect, or other Midwestern states, there is kind of a dynamic here where a lot of the Republicans who are elected outstate, kind of campaign against the city as like a bastion of, wokeness or crime. It's scary to go downtown, this and that. But I think that, really the two, Renee Good and Alex Preddy were killed, and just the other stories we've seen of people being terrorized and brutalized. I mean, I don't think this plays well for kind of middle of the road voters. And I think, most Republicans understand that on some level. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of I guess kind of a sideshow, or not, it shouldn't be the central thing. I mean, politics isn't everything, but I think it does kind of speak to the cruelty that's at the heart of Trumpism. And, the other thing on just to note, I think had Republicans really stuck with the fraud messaging, now that it has been a real weakness here for Democrats. And the blame game, I think, is oversimplified, where people want to put it all on Tim Walz or on Keith Ellison. And, I don't think that's really an accurate depiction of what happened coming out of COVID, where fraud was a big thing, throughout the entire country, with some of the government spending that was going on and the lack of safeguards. But, had Republicans kind of stuck with that, I think they would have had a potent political message. But the fact that they turned it into kind of this hate campaign against Somalis and, brutalized people here in the Twin Cities, I think really has created a perfect storm where it's going to be a tough year for them.
They do not understand Americans, Aaron. I mean, after 9/11, in rural America, all over the country, people said, we're all New Yorkers today, right? Americans rally when great cities are attacked. Can you hear me, or is there a lag?
I can hear you. Your video is lagging a little bit there, but I can hear you just fine.
Okay. And when Minneapolis was attacked, when Chicago was attacked, Americans said, no, these are our cities. And it didn't matter that it was the federal government's troops and their, these stormtroopers in our cities. Americans didn't like it, and they don't like it. And the Republicans still don't get it. I mean, that hearing with Pam Bondi, we'll get to that one separate. The hearings on ICE that happened this week, where they just want to talk about everyone who disagrees with them as agitators, right? Those agitators. And yet they went into court today and said, oh, we're sorry. I know we accused the people we shot of being agitators. Our bad. They didn't do anything wrong. Let them go. The folks in Congress are the last to know, I guess.
Yeah, and that is really going to be fascinating to see how this plays out, where, I think part of, I don't know if this was intentional, but I could certainly see on the Trump administration's behalf that, maybe the motivation for the timing of announcing that Operation Metro Surge was ending and that DHS is being withdrawn is to kind of blunt the political weapon that has become for Democrats, where it's like, we can't fund the government if they are terrorizing and killing people. Maybe that was part of it, is that now it maybe is a little harder of a position for Democrats to maintain. But they're in a spot now where, most Republicans are defending things like, basically having secret police who are unidentified, wearing masks, running around. And that's been one to me where, it's kind of felt like the frog in the boiling water a little bit, where, the fact that you have kind of like Republican leaders making a case that that's normal or acceptable, when the rationale that they're offering for why it's necessary is like kind of this daydream that they have about law enforcement officers being doxxed or people showing up and harassing their families. There's been no documented instances of this, literally zero. So, it's kind of like this daydream. And, the fact that we've had law enforcement going back to, the beginning of organized police departments here in the United States who have been fine operating with badges and with their faces out. And now suddenly, this idea that they can't. The only reason that they are wearing masks is because they want impunity to commit crimes. And there's no other, at least to my knowledge, comparable developed nation where that is a thing, having basically secret police like that. So that, that does kind of scare me a little bit, that, Republicans seem to feel no shame about that, or kind of compunction that, it's really kind of an escalation of, an authoritarian takeover in our country. Of course, people will have a chance later this year at the ballot box to weigh in. But, before then, hopefully, we can get to a spot where we're not having another city that's the next Minneapolis that is, where people are killed and terrorized, and, and businesses shut down, and schools, kids don't want to go to school for fear that their families are going to be torn apart. So, you do kind of hope that the administration will learn a lesson from this. But I think that, most of the 13 months that they have been in office, they haven't really behaved like they are fearing democratic accountability. And that does kind of scare me. Although I will say that the fact, that Homan had that news conference yesterday and tried to at least kind of say mostly the right things, to me was kind of a heartening reminder that some of the normal dynamics of politics still seem to be effective, even as clearly there's an authoritarian takeover that's being attempted right now.
Yeah, I hear that. I don't credit Homan with anything but trying to make sure the funding comes through. But the off ramps that Republicans have had for years from Donald Trump have been huge, bigger than the ones on the on I-94 running across the country, and they haven't taken any of them. And here they had another one and they didn't take it. And you're right about the boiling water metaphor, because as they stay with Trump, they find themselves in places that are completely indefensible. Oh my God, fossil fuels don't cause climate change this week, right? Yeah. It's okay to have your armed thugs on our streets. Oh no, we're not going to do anything about antitrust because we think corporations by themselves will make sure people get lower prices. You can just go down the list of terrible, awful things. And this is just 1 week. And Pam Bondi saying to Congress, no, we don't believe in oversight. That's not your job. You're here to kiss the president's ass. And if you do anything other than that, we're going to surveil you and we'll probably indict you.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I would, my slight pushback would be that I think Trump got away with a lot in his first term, because I think there was a sense that, if you were kind of like a normie American who didn't really follow politics that close, that you could kind of safely tune it out. And, there was kind of a broad sense until COVID that the economy was strong, and that, sure, Trump is kind of this eccentric character, but, you can kind of safely ignore what's going on in DC, and life for most people probably felt mostly normal, especially if you were a white person. Mm-hmm. And I think now, we're seeing some cracks in that where, it was kind of a strange news morning this morning, because, this inflation report came out that actually seemed to be pretty bullish, in the sense that, inflation was down, I think it was 2.3 or 4%, which is pretty much at range of what the target should be. And, you sort of had the administration attempting to take a victory lap on this, but, the polling in terms of economic sentiment is still really negative. And, I think there's kind of a sense out there that it's a really soft job market, especially if you are a younger person trying to kind of crack in to the job market.
I've raised it. It's hard.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that that's kind of it's a dynamic that we didn't experience at all in Trump's first term, until, COVID was such a unique thing that it's hard to kind of compare it to anything. But, up until that point of 2020, it was like, well, the economy is pretty good. And so that was kind of the secret sauce, it felt like, for Trump, where he could get away with all this other stuff. And now that isn't really the case. And I think there's also a sense that Trump kind of wrecked the economy, right? Because, people were upset over inflation in 2022, 2023, but by the time 2024 came around, we had pretty close to full employment, strong economic growth. Inflation had been tamed, wages were outpacing inflation. Now, of course, people were still upset enough to elect Trump, which, you and I remember talking on your show during the campaign, how crazy it was to try and process at the time, when Trump kind of pulled ahead in the polling or when Biden got out, just kind of making sense of that election was really difficult. And I think we'll never really totally come to terms with what happened there. But, I think there's kind of a broad-based sense that Trump made economic conditions worse with tariffs and that, he's extremely corrupt. I don't think anybody's really under any illusions that, selling off pardons and enriching his family through these crypto schemes. And none of this, I think, none of that is really popular. And because people are kind of upset with the economy or not satisfied with it, I think it makes it a lot harder to tune that stuff out. And I think, you see, it is frustrating that his polling still is kind of within like a band of normalcy. But I mean, I think it was Pew yesterday had his approval at the lowest it's ever been, right? I think it's like 38% or something like that. So we're starting to get into sort of wave territory, where if this holds through the year, and now, you and I could have a whole, we could talk for 2 hours about kind of the worries we have over whether we're going to have free and fair elections or what Trump will try to do to put a thumb on the scale for Republicans. But, kind of assuming that we have mostly a normal election this year and assuming that Trump kind of stays where he's at right now. And I don't see a lot of reason to believe his numbers are going to improve. I think we are looking at, Dems obviously retaking the House, and then, Senate's probably about a coin flip, maybe a slight Republican advantage there. But if that's how it plays out, we'll have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about a year from now, right? Because we'll be talking about impeachment again, and we'll be talking about the jockeying among the Republicans for the nomination, and Trump will fully at that point be a lame duck. So a lot of this is kind of it's a little bit of like kind of trying to game out the future. Obviously, with Trump as president is kind of a difficult thing, so I don't want to get too ahead of our skis. And you're right to point out, I mean, the endangerment finding being rescinded yesterday was obviously a disaster for the future of humanity, not just this country. That the world's largest economy is kind of fully rejecting science. And even myself as someone, I have a bunch of travel coming up, which I'm not a huge traveler, but I have a little bit of work and a little bit of pleasure travel coming up. And like even the TSA stuff is kind of scary because it's like, oh my God, they almost apparently were using drones down in Texas that there was some concern on the FAA's part that they would take down a plane. And the fact that we have clowns in charge obviously has a lot of downstream consequences. And I think people are they've woken up to that now at this point, but obviously it's too late to really do anything until November of this year. And, there isn't a ton of indication that Republicans are really breaking with Trump in any sort of meaningful way. Although I will say, obviously, his tariffs against Canada were rejected this week. So, there is signs of cracking kind of on the margins. But, until we get that first Senate Republican who, gives a speech on the floor denouncing Trump and Trumpism. I'm looking more for signs like that than kind of the things on the margins that we've seen so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think Republicans are breaking with Trump, but not the ones in Washington. I think you look at the polling, the Republicans are with Trump entirely, but the number of Republicans in the country is smaller and smaller, right? So people who say I'm conservative and have been principled conservatives are just leaving that party because there's no home for them there. So it's become the MAGA party, and that's a smaller party, but they have an enormous amount of power right now. And they're using it so coercively. I mean, Don Lemon is being arraigned, I think, as we are talking. Do you take that as the Trump administration saying to independent journalists like you, hey, we know you don't have a big corporation's insurance to wrap around you and we're coming after you, which is, I think, the message he's trying to say.
Yeah, a little bit. I've had to think about that a lot. And I'll be honest that I have taken kind of some steps to protect myself, not in any sort of like, I don't have like a lawyer on retainer or anything like that, but, certainly with stuff that I publish, I try to really make sure that to err on the side of not exposing myself to legal liability if I can avoid it. And, and I've been around the block enough times where I'm, kind of effective at that, where it doesn't compromise the content, but, just kind of word choice things. There was one, I had a certain writer about, this was back, I guess, during the campaign where, he was describing Trump in this piece as a rapist over and over. And, and I talked with him and kind of explained that, and the writer here, he had a whole kind of defense for this. Where like, well, the judge in the E. Jean Carroll case said that word was appropriate. And so, it wasn't coming out of nowhere. He wasn't trying to be like a bomb thrower. But I kind of explained like, look, I think let's just like kind of play this safe and say adjudicated sexual abuser or something like that. And then, you know, about a month later was when Trump sued ABC over like the same thing, basically, you know, that they described him as a rapist. And so, I mean, just little things like that, you know, I try to kind of make sure that I you know, cross my T's and dot the I's kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, the Don Lemon thing is a little bit of a, obviously it's a very chilling thing, but I think given the set of circumstances there that, you know, it came amid this metro surge in the Twin Cities and, you know, sort of this like protest at a church. I mean, the one thing we have kind of learned, I guess, through Trump is that, you know, grand juries will bring an indictment in a lot of cases, but, you know, we've seen them even kind of push that past the breaking point with, you know, these Democrats who put together the video encouraging troops or kind of reminding them that they're obligated not to obey illegal orders. And then, you know, just this week news broke that they failed to secure an indictment there, or with like the Comey and Letitia James situations where, you know, they've gotten some pushback from grand juries, you know, in a number of different cases. So yeah, you know, that one was interesting to me, the Lemon one, that they were able to secure one there. You know, he's got enough resources. I would assume that he'll be able to get a good lawyer, you know, who can help him through that. Yes. But obviously, you know, he had to travel from LA here to be arraigned. So, you know, it certainly isn't something that you want to go through. But you know, I guess one of the things, I mean, this seems like very slender kind of reassurance, but, you know, they were literally trying to crowdsource U.S. attorneys on Twitter the other week, right? Because so many people have resigned, including here in Minnesota, where like the entire U.S. attorney's office basically quit. That these things, you know, they might have high ambitions, but when you can't get competent people to work for you, I think we kind of see how that can go badly. Although, you know, they still have enough competence, at least in this case with Don Lemon, to indict him and sort of make his life miserable. And you're right that does send kind of downstream messages to people like me or other people who are inclined to cover them critically.
Aaron, reporting, even when it includes video clips, misses something essential. And in the case of Donald Trump, it doesn't just miss something, it's often misleading. Did you understand back in 2017 when you started down this path as deeply as you have, that you were building a journalist's model of truth telling that wasn't really out there before?
Well, that's really high praise that you would characterize it that way. I hadn't really thought of it like that. So I guess the answer is no. I mean, I was kind of responding mostly to market incentives at that time. You know, I won't go through the entire story, but I sort of stumbled into the video work based on a newsroom training we had on Snapstream. And I know that Lincoln Square actually is also a client of Snapstreams. And I told one of my Snapstream contacts I was going on your show, and he asked me to at least mention Snapstream since since we're both clients. So there we go. Yeah. But in any event, so anyway, I had this training on Snapstream, and I was at home. I was working at Think Progress at the time as an editor, and so I had Fox on in the background, and this was right after the Charlottesville riots had occurred. So John Kelly at that time was the White House chief of staff, and he was on Laura Ingram's show, and he made a defense of the Charlottesville white nationalists on the basis of basically like heritage, not hate, was essentially his argument that, they're not necessarily glorifying these people with the statues. It's just, this is their culture and this and that. So, I heard this, and it kind of sent a little alarm off in my head that, oh man, this would be kind of a good clip to put out there. And you have to remember in 2017, there weren't a lot of people doing that. Like a couple people at Media Matters were maybe doing clipping. But so anyway, I employed the training that we had and put this clip out on Twitter. And by the time I woke up the next morning, it had like 2,000 or 3,000 retweets. And I was like, oh my goodness, like there's clearly, a lot of demand for this style of reporting. And so it was really easy for me as an editor to kind of incorporate clipping into my workflow, because I was watching all of these events anyway. I was watching the Trump speeches, the White House press briefings, congressional hearings. And so just to take the extra 20 seconds to transcribe and, hit the tweet button, basically, it wasn't really, making it possible for me to edit or, assign stories or do the kind of the blog style writing that I was doing at the time. So from there, my accounts just kind of grew exponentially. So it was never really intentional, that I set out to do anything. But then, by the time I was kind of winding down at Vox and going independent, I had an idea of what I wanted to do. Although the thing that I didn't really foresee was Trump winning again, because now that we're back in this place where like every day is just like it's like a 5-alarm fire in terms of things going on in DC or out, wherever Trump is traveling to. I could spend, 24/7 basically clipping. and never be bored. I probably need, some pretty strong therapy after all that, but there's just a lot going on. Most of it is grim, but obviously it's important stuff. And so I do in some level feel kind of grateful to be able to cover it for a living.
I mean, a lot of people cover Trump, but there's something about seeing in real, seeing at some length what he does that's different. I mean, I think you coined the term sane-washing for, like when reporters try and report on what he said at an event, there's such chaos that comes out of his mouth, such madness, that when they try and report on it in good faith, like what did the president talk about? They naturally say, well, he said we should raise tariffs, or he said, but he said a lot of other things. And the way you have made it accessible for Americans to see that all that other stuff, it is a different way of telling the truth that gets at a reality of this madman that's hard to see otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's right, because, I think most major outlets are kind of inclined toward, they're trying to find what the news is, right? So it's like, okay, Trump had this announcement that he's increasing tariffs on Canada or something. And so that's kind of what you get, and then, you might find like some sort of sanitized quote that, represents the news. And so that's what they include in the story. But then, you seem like you're kind of a partisan actor if you say he was incoherent and he was unhinged and, this and that, which are accurate, which are most of the time accurate, almost all the time with them, accurate descriptors of his conduct. But, it puts you into kind of a different category. Now, I will say there is still kind of good reporting out there. I mean, I don't know if you read the piece today that was in, of all places, the Wall Street Journal on Corey Lewandowski and Kristi Noem. And, it was one of these like...
Aaron, let me caveat this. There is great reporting going on all over America. And there are things that good investigative journalists do that you can't do in clips, right? But digging in. And there are things that sometimes the press corps in DC gets absolutely right. We need all of it. But the gap in not being able to see the madness is a real one that I think you filled, because, what do you think? You've probably watched this man more than most people who aren't in his family. Maybe actually more than the people in his family who don't seem to be with him very much. How do you credit the conversations about his health, about his mental health, about his physical health? I mean, you've really watched him over time.
Yeah. I will say I'm alarmed by the recurring injury on his hand that we've never really gotten an explanation for. Because my assumption, and I'm not a doctor, but, it definitely seems to be an indication that he's getting some sort of ongoing treatment that seems pretty intense, and your hand is like, basically black, to the extent where they're kind of painting over it. Now, with the mental health stuff, I've always been a little bit skeptical of like the claims that, he has dementia or, he's senile, this and that. Cause, people were saying this, back in 2017, 18, this is nothing really new. And, I thought his years out of office seemed to kind of refresh him in a way where, at least kind of early on, 2023 into 24 during the primaries, there seemed to be a little more kind of like verve to his rallies than there were like during COVID, when he was getting out on the road a little bit there at the end. And that's just kind of natural, I guess, when you're in your 70s, if you take a little bit easier, maybe you have a little more in the tank when you need it kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And he still does keep a pretty rigorous schedule, for a man his age. I mean, today he just had a giggle with reporters outside the White House. And now he's going to do a speech, and then he'll probably talk to reporters again on the way back. And, this isn't really to credit him, because a lot of what he says is complete nonsense. And I think that's what you're getting to earlier with like how a lot of people who aren't necessarily immersed in the news don't necessarily realize that because they're not paying close attention to them. But, I do think there is clearly some sort of physical ailment with him that we've never really gotten to the bottom of. Mm-hmm. And, I think part of this is that the White House explanations have been so preposterous, between he's just shaking hands so much that it's bruising his hand, or, he's taking too much aspirin and that's why he's bruising so easily. I think we all kind of understand that that's not really what's going on here. So I'm sure there is some sort of big story there that we don't know and maybe never will. But, and there's also, it's kind of a cyclical thing where it's usually toward the back half of the month. He'll really start, like his hand will start to look really bad in his public appearances. And then he'll kind of disappear for a couple of days. He'll have a weekend where he's sort of out of view, and you kind of wonder if he's convalescing because he has some sort of treatment. Again, these are just kind of guesstimations because we don't know. But so yeah, I mean, I do think there's a cover up of some sort of physical ailment. But mentally, I think he's kind of the same guy that he was his first term. I think the main difference is that his first term, he still had at least a handful of kind of quote unquote adults around him who curbed some of the worst excesses that he may have wanted to pursue at one time or another. And now that has been kind of flipped entirely the other way, where it seems like people like Stephen Miller, if anything, are more radical than he is.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like a losing battle, where he ends up kind of it seems like Stephen Miller is kind of running the show in a lot of ways, whereas his first term, whether it was a John Kelly or a Mark Esper, even Bill Barr, who kind of pieced out, did a lot of terrible things for Trump, and then after the efforts to kind of overthrow the election began, leading up into January 6th, kind of exited stage left at that point. He doesn't have those people around him anymore. And so it's just kind of people who sort of encourage his worst impulses. I think that's kind of more of the issue than like any sort of psychological decline. Although at 80, certainly that could be happening. So it's probably kind of a combination of factors there.
That's interesting. Well, let's talk about some of the things you saw this week. I mean, in the ICE hearings in the Senate, you had a clip. Honestly, I know these are not funny. This is serious stuff, but I laughed out loud because Ron Johnson is the dumbest box of rocks in the United States Senate. And you had, can you talk about what you like, just that exchange that you posted?
Yeah. So Keith Ellison was testifying before the Senate. Obviously it was kind of a combo platter of like the DHS response, and then Ron Johnson wanted to talk about fraud and Ellison's alleged role in it. And I don't know if there's some sort of backstory there. I was trying to think about that. I mean, obviously Ellison was a member of Congress, and so I wouldn't be surprised if he had some sort of relationship with Ron Johnson back from those days.
Mm-hmm.
But this clip, and I'd encourage people to seek it out if you haven't seen it, because Johnson really kind of like lost his mind. And it ended up said something to Ellison like, "You disgust me," and this was over the idea. It was like kind of like beyond parody, because I kept waiting for the sort of the punchline to arrive. But Johnson at one point was like, "So you went out and you encouraged people to use their First Amendment rights and protest." And Ellison was like, "Yeah, I support the First Amendment." But this seemed to kind of like trigger Ron Johnson, that he was upset, that an attorney general would tell people that they have the constitutional right to peacefully protest. So that seemed to be really the gripe. And then, he's been doing a lot of hits on right-wing TV where he describes Renee Good and Alex Preddy as martyrs, and sort of has this talking point about like, well, the Democrats have their martyrs now. And, he really seems not to be a fan of the First Amendment is kind of what it boils down to. And, and this has been, we're kind of seeing that it's not just Trump. I mean, you can kind of go down the line with a lot of the Republican Party. I mean, whether it's the First Amendment, even the Second Amendment in the Preddy instance, or, the Fourth Amendment with a lot of the DHS activities. Yeah. I mean, you can kind of take your pick. I mean, there's a lot of different amendments that are under assault from the right, the supposed kind of law and order party. And I thought that was one where the mask really slipped because, like I said, Johnson had this line of questioning about Ellison and what he said to protesters. And I kept waiting for like, some sort of follow-up question, which would kind of reveal what the point of it was. But it just really seemed to be basically that he was upset.
He doesn't like the First Amendment.
Upset about the First Amendment, and just kind of had a meltdown when Ellison sort of smirked at him instead of indulging in his bad faith line of questioning.
It was a great clip. By the way, the MAGA party doesn't just dislike some of the amendments. They're very annoyed at Article 1 that says Congress has any power. They're very annoyed at Article 3 that say courts can constrain him. I mean, they are of the dictator mold. And so there are a lot of parts of our Constitution they don't like. And they're of the sort of racist dictator mode. So there are whole chunks of our Declaration of Independence, that whole bit about equality, they don't like either. So.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think that's really a big difference between Trump 2 and Trump 1 is that, that there were obviously with some of the family separation in Trump 1 and, he really obviously with freedom of the press, his wanting to shut down broadcast stations, but it was kind of, Trump 1, a lot of the stuff never really made it past the level of like tweets, where Trump would say something on Twitter. I mean, I don't want to downplay family separation because that was obviously reality and that was a policy. Which is also worth kind of remembering that really did a number on Trump's polling in 2018 and was one of the big reasons I think that Republicans had such a bad midterm cycle that year. But, now, it gets back to that point that I just made earlier about like the difference being that, Trump won, he would kind of rail on Twitter and say all sorts of crazy stuff, but it never really penetrated into like the policy realm. But because he's surrounded by people who, are very intent on turning his worst impulses into policy, now when he says this stuff, I mean, you have to really take it seriously. And, and I think this kind of campaign that we're seeing against a basket of constitutional rights is sort of an example of that, it's not just Ron Johnson saying this stuff. I mean, we're literally seeing it on the streets in cities like the one that I'm in right now. So, but that was an interesting day of hearings. But you had the dynamic a little bit later on during those hearings of, and I don't want to give too much credit to Rand Paul at all, because I think, he's mostly been terrible. But on the DHS Alex Preddy stuff, you had the weird dynamic where he was questioning the ICE and CBP leaders, and was really kind of pointing out that kind of just common sense stuff, that if you watch the video, there's no world in which Preddy was being aggressive or representing any sort of threat to these officers. And so, it is heartening to me that you still have kind of voices in the wilderness there, like Rand Paul, who at least are not kind of peeing on your shoe and telling you that it's raining, and that at least have enough sort of basic common sense left to sort of acknowledge what everybody has seen in these videos. But you would wish that that penetrated a little bit further in the Republican Party than just kind of like the exceptions on the fringe.
Yeah, never enough to break a majority. They do their math. They'll let a few guys off each time, but not enough ever to make sure the vote doesn't go their way.
Yeah. I mean, Edwin, I do regret to say that I do see Trump taking the stage here. So I got a couple more minutes, but yeah.
I know. I really appreciate your time. Yeah. I got more of it than I thought I was going to get. Good luck. I hope that it's not completely insane, but it's a hope that I'm sure will be dashed.
Yeah. I'm watching it right now. He is actually, I can tell that he's reading the teleprompter right now. So that can change moment by moment.
Aaron,
I don't think I missed anything too crazy quite yet.
Before you go, tell people how to find your stuff.
Yeah. And Edwin, thanks for having me on the show. I'd be, some future Friday when things are a little less hectic, I'd love to do it again. Yep. People can find me at publicnotice.co is the home for the newsletter. We're publishing 6 days a week these days. So it's been really proud of the coverage that we're doing. It's kind of a team effort. So that's kind of my main, work product. But then on socials, you can find me at @Rupar on Twitter, Aaron.Rupar on Blue Sky, and I believe Aaron.Rupar also on Threads. So thanks again for having me. Keep up the good work yourself. It's always nice to catch up a little bit, and hope we have a chance to do it again before too long.
I agree, Aaron. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, everybody. I apologize for the lag in my screen. I hope you can hear me clearly. I will work on whatever my camera issues are. But Aaron is a great guy doing great work. And so I'm glad we got a chance to talk today. As always, I appreciate your being with me. I appreciate your being on in this journey. And you know what? We're winning. This is, as I said, our year from going from defense to offense, and we are doing it. They don't like it. They're making stuff up. They're panicked. So keep the pressure on. Call your folks in Congress. Make sure they stay strong. Do not cave, and until we get some control over these thugs in our cities' streets. And more to come. See you next week.